He caught the betrayal on camera, yet stayed calm. While she thought she had the upper hand, he executed the quietest, most precise breakup ever. No yelling, no chaos, just a masterclass in dignity, consequences, and moving on. Before jumping forward in the story, please subscribe my channel and share this video.
A few years back, one of my closest friends went through something that none of us will ever forget. To this day, whenever we sit together and the topic of relationships comes up, someone eventually says, "Remember what you did?" And we all just shake our heads and laugh. But at the time, it wasn't funny. Not at all. He had been living with his girlfriend for almost 2 years. They met through mutual friends, hit it off fast, and within 6 months, she had basically moved into his apartment. It wasn't some huge romantic plan, it just kind of happened. One toothbrush turned into 2. A drawer became half hers. Then suddenly she had clothes in the closet, shoes by the door, and her favorite coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet. The apartment was his. He had signed the lease long before she came along. It was a simple month-to-month place, nothing fancy, but it was comfortable. He paid the rent, she helped with groceries and utilities. On paper, she didn't exist in that apartment. For a long time, things were good. They traveled a bit, hosted small dinners, and looked like one of those solid couples that would probably end up married. At least that's what we all thought. But slowly, things changed. They started arguing more. Small things at first. Dishes in the sink, texting too much at night, tone of voice. Then bigger things, where the relationship was going. Money, commitment, future plans. She became distant. He tried to fix things, suggested date nights, suggested talking things out calmly. Sometimes it worked for a day or two, then back to cold air between them. He told me once, "It feels like she's already halfway out the door." A few weeks later, she announced she was going to visit her family. They lived about 600 kilometers away. She said she needed space, needed time to think, needed to reconnect with her parents and clear her head. He didn't argue, he even helped her pack. "Maybe the break will help," he told us. He was trying to sound hopeful, but something in his voice was tired. The morning she left, he drove her to the train station. She hugged him quickly, almost formally. No long kiss, no clinging goodbye, just a simple, "We'll talk soon." The first 2 days were quiet, too quiet. He texted her, she replied, but hours later. Short replies, no pictures of her family, no updates, just vague answers like, "Yeah, just relaxing," or "spending time with everyone." On the 3rd evening, something happened that changed everything. He had gone out with a coworker for dinner at a place downtown. It wasn't even planned, just a last-minute thing because he didn't want to sit alone in the apartment again. The restaurant had a large patio area, full of people laughing, drinking, enjoying the warm weather. He almost didn't notice at first, but then he froze. Across the patio, at a corner table near the railing, was his girlfriend, laughing, leaning across the table, reaching for the hand of a guy sitting opposite her. Not her father, not her brother, her ex. The same ex she had always described as toxic, manipulative, and a mistake. They weren't just talking, they weren't just catching up. They were comfortable, intimate, the kind of body language you can't fake. His heart didn't race, that's what he told me later. It didn't even break in that dramatic movie way. It just went cold. He stepped back into the shadows near the entrance and watched for a moment longer. She leaned over and kissed him, not a friendly cheek kiss, a real one. That was enough. Instead of storming over, instead of shouting or causing a scene, he did something none of us expected when he told the story later. He pulled out his phone, calmly, steadily, and took photos. Several of them. Clear shots. Her face, the ex's face, their hands intertwined, the kiss, the wine glasses, the entire setting. Then he put his phone away. He didn't confront her, he didn't text her, he didn't call. He simply walked back to his car and drove home. That night, he didn't drink, didn't cry, didn't rage. He sat on the couch in the quiet apartment, his apartment, and thought. She had lied, not just about where she was, about everything. About needing space, about going to see her family, about working on us. He realized something important in that silence. If she could lie that smoothly, if she could kiss another man while still living under his roof, then the relationship was already over. He just hadn't signed the papers yet. The next morning, he called his landlord. Now, this landlord was an older guy, straightforward, fair, the kind of person who fixes things quickly and doesn't snoop into tenants' lives. My friend explained everything, calmly, clearly. No yelling, no drama. He asked one simple question. If I give my 60-day notice now, we're good? The landlord said yes. Month-to-month lease, 60 days required. That was it. Then my friend asked another question. She's not on the lease. Legally, she's just staying with me, right? The landlord confirmed it. Only his name was on the paperwork. There was a long pause on the phone. Then my friend said, "Okay, I'll bring the notice by this afternoon." And just like that, the first piece of the plan clicked into place. He printed the photos, multiple copies, put them in a plain folder. He didn't send them, didn't confront her, didn't hint that he knew anything. When she texted that night saying, "Miss you," he replied, "Miss you too." When she called 2 days later, he answered normally, asked about her family. She told him stories, fake ones. He listened. Something had shifted inside him. He wasn't emotional anymore. He was strategic. He started apartment hunting quietly, found a new place within 2 weeks, signed the lease, arranged a moving company for the exact date his 60 days would end, all while she continued living her double life. When she returned from her family trip, she acted like nothing was wrong, brought him a small souvenir, gave him a casual hug, complained about the long travel. He hugged her back, watched her carefully. If she felt guilty, she hid it well. Over the next few weeks, he played the part perfectly. He suggested maybe they should try couples therapy, not in an accusing way, just casually, like someone trying to save a struggling relationship. She agreed half-heartedly, but never actually booked anything. She started staying out late more often, saying she was with friends. Sometimes she said she'd just crash at a friend's place because it was closer to work. He never argued, just said, "Okay." Meanwhile, the landlord kept his word and stayed quiet. When prospective tenants came to view the apartment, it was always during hours she was at work or out with friends. They coordinated carefully. Boxes slowly appeared in the storage closet, his things packed neatly. Important documents already moved to his new apartment, anything valuable secured. He didn't rush, he didn't slip, he waited. Because he wasn't just leaving, he was planning something that would make sure she understood exactly what she had done without him ever raising his voice. And the day of the move was getting closer, very close. By the time the last month of the lease started, he had already emotionally checked out. From the outside, though, you would never guess. He still made coffee in the morning, still asked her how her day was, still sat beside her on the couch at night while she scrolled through her phone. If anyone had walked in, they would see a couple going through a rough patch, maybe, but nothing dramatic. Inside, though, everything was different. He had printed the photos and tucked them into a simple brown envelope in his desk drawer. He didn't look at them often, he didn't need to. The image of her laughing across that restaurant patio was burned into his mind. She continued her new routine: late nights, girls' dinners, random sleepovers at friends' places. He stopped asking questions completely. That confused her at first. One night she said, "You don't seem bothered anymore." He just shrugged. "I figured we both need space." She looked at him strangely, almost suspiciously, but then nodded. Maybe she had gotten away with it. Maybe she thought he was weak. Either way, she relaxed even more, and that made things easier for him. The landlord kept his word and stayed quiet, When prospective tenants came to view the apartment, it was always during hours she was at work or out with friends. They coordinated carefully. Boxes slowly appeared in the storage closet, his things packed neatly, important documents already moved to his new apartment, anything valuable secured. He didn't rush, he didn't slip, he waited, because he wasn't just leaving, he was planning something that would make sure she understood exactly what she had done without him ever raising his voice. And the day of the move was getting closer, very close. By the time the last month of the lease started, he had already emotionally checked out. From the outside, though, you would never guess. He still made coffee in the morning, still asked her how her day was, still sat beside her on the couch at night while she scrolled through her phone. If anyone had walked in, they would see a couple going through a rough patch, maybe, but nothing dramatic. Inside, though, everything was different. He had printed the photos and tucked them into a simple brown envelope in his desk drawer. He didn't look at them often, he didn't need to. The image of her laughing across that restaurant patio was burned into his mind. She continued her new routine, late nights, girls' dinners. When he walked out of that apartment, he didn't slam the door, he didn't make a dramatic exit. He just stepped into the hallway, closed it quietly behind him, and took a slow breath. Inside, he could faintly hear movement, drawers opening, her footsteps, maybe panic starting to settle in. But he didn't stay to watch. He drove straight to his new place. The moving crew had already unloaded everything earlier that morning. His couch was set up, the bed was assembled, boxes stacked neatly against the wall. It wasn't fully arranged yet, but it was home. A clean one. He sat down on his couch, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself feel something. Not rage, not heartbreak, relief. His phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. He didn't pick it up immediately. He let it vibrate on the coffee table for a full minute before finally checking it. 15 missed calls, texts pouring in. What is this? Are you serious right now? Call me. You can't just do this. Please answer. Let's talk about this. He read them all calmly. Then one more message came through. I made a mistake. He stared at that one longer than the others. A mistake. Not lies, not cheating, not betrayal. A mistake. He locked his phone and leaned back. About an hour later, the landlord called. She's moving fast, the landlord said. Called someone to come help her, but she's upset. My friend just replied, okay. The landlord paused. You sure you're good? Yeah. And he meant it. Back at the apartment, according to what the landlord later told him, she had gone through all the stages in fast forward. First, denial, then anger. She apparently shouted at the empty walls for a while, called him names, accused him of spying, claimed he invaded her privacy. Then bargaining. She sent him a long message explaining how she had been confused, how the rough patch made her feel lonely, how her ex just showed up, how it didn't mean anything. But the photos told a different story. They didn't look confused, they looked comfortable. Then came panic, because the clock was ticking. She called friends to come help her move. The problem was simple. She had nowhere to go immediately. Her family really did live 600 kilometers away, and apparently her ex wasn't offering a place to stay. That part, we later found out, hurt her pride the most. By late afternoon, he finally responded with a single text. You have until midnight. No insults, no debate, just facts. She called again right after that message. This time he answered. Her voice was shaky. Why didn't you just talk to me? He stayed calm. You were supposed to be with your family. Silence. I was going to tell you, she said. When? He asked, simply. More silence. She tried another angle. We could have worked through this. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't justify. You made your choice. I made mine. She began crying then, real crying, not dramatic, just raw. For a brief second, he almost felt bad. Almost. But then the image of her laughing across that patio flashed in his mind again, and the feeling disappeared. By evening, most of her things were packed into garbage bags and borrowed boxes. A couple of her friends came to help. None of them looked him in the eye when they carried items down the stairs. Word spreads fast in friend groups. They likely knew the truth by then. Around 10:30 p.m., the landlord sent him a final update. "She's almost done." At 11:58 p.m., she sent him one last message. "I can't believe you did this." He didn't respond. At 12:07 a.m., the landlord texted him, "She's out, apartment is empty." And just like that, it was over. No screaming match, no broken plates, no drawn-out breakup, just precision. The next morning, he went back to the old apartment one final time to hand over the keys. The place was completely empty now, freshly swept, echoing. He walked through each room slowly. Living room, bedroom, kitchen, no memories left behind. The landlord handed him the security deposit in full. "You handled that cleaner than most people would," he said. My friend just nodded. Later that weekend, we all met up. Word had already spread through our circle. Everyone wanted details. He told the story calmly, step by step. When he described taking the photos instead of confronting her, we all leaned in. When he explained coordinating with the landlord, we started shaking our heads. But when he got to the moving day, the piles of her belongings in the middle of the empty apartment, that's when the table exploded. "Cold," someone said. "Legend," another said. But here's the thing, he didn't smile much while telling it, because underneath the smooth execution, there had been 2 years of love. Real memories, real plans. Revenge sounds dramatic, but what he really did wasn't revenge in the loud, explosive way people imagine. It was controlled. It was quiet. It was final. A few weeks later, we heard through mutual friends that she had tried reaching out again. Apparently, the ex wasn't interested in a relationship. It had been temporary for him. She ended up moving back to her parents' place. Meanwhile, my friend settled into his new apartment, new routine, new energy. He joined a gym, started going out more. Slowly, he began dating again. But he kept one photo. Not the kiss, not the hand-holding. He kept the last one he took. The picture of her standing in the empty apartment, surrounded by her boxed-up belongings. Not to humiliate her, but to remind himself of one thing. When someone shows you exactly who they are, believe them. And in our friend group, that story still gets told. Not because of the cheating, but because of the calm, surgical way he closed that chapter. No yelling, no begging, no second chances. Just consequences. Life didn't magically become perfect after that night. People love to think a story like this ends with the hero walking into the sunset completely unbothered. But real life doesn't work that way. Even when you handle something with calm and control, it still leaves a mark. The first week in the new apartment felt strange for him. It was quiet in a different way. Not tense quiet, not awkward quiet, just empty. He would wake up in the morning and instinctively expect to hear someone else moving around, the sound of the shower running, the clink of coffee mugs, but there was nothing, just him. He didn't regret what he did, not even for a second, but that didn't mean he didn't feel the loss of what he thought he had. One evening, about 10 days after everything ended, his phone buzzed again. Her name. He stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hello?" She sounded different this time. No anger, no panic, just tired. "I just wanted to talk," she said quietly. He didn't hang up. They talked for almost 20 minutes. She admitted more than she had before. The ex had messaged her months earlier. They had been talking secretly for a while. When things got rough in the relationship, she leaned into that attention instead of fixing what was in front of her. "It felt exciting," she admitted, "like I wasn't stuck." That word stuck. Stuck. He had been building a life with her, paying rent, planning trips, talking about long-term goals, and she felt stuck? He didn't argue. He just said, "You could have left." Silence on the other end. She didn't have an answer for that. After that call, he felt lighter. Not because she apologized, but because he finally heard the full truth. It wasn't a one-night mistake. It was a choice. That made moving on easier. A few weeks later, we all went out for drinks like we used to. It had been a while since he laughed freely, but that night he did. Really laughed. Someone joked about him offering consulting services for clean breakups. He shook his head. "It's not about revenge," he said. "It's about self-respect." And that's what the real core of it was. He never posted about it online, never blasted her name, never shared the photos publicly. In fact, outside of our close group, very few people even knew the details. She, on the other hand, struggled more. Mutual friends slowly distanced themselves from her, not because he demanded it, he never asked anyone to choose sides, but because people saw how she handled things. Trust, once broken that way, spreads cracks beyond just two people. A month later, she tried one more time. She showed up at his new apartment. He hadn't given her the address. She must have asked around. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, he didn't look shocked, just steady. She looked smaller somehow, less confident than before. "Can we try again?" she asked, straight to the point. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "Why?" he asked calmly. She began crying again. Said she missed him, said the ex was a mistake, said she didn't realize what she had until it was gone. He listened. Then he said something simple. "You didn't lose me, you traded me." That hit harder than any yelling ever could. She didn't argue, because she knew it was true. After that night, she stopped trying. Months passed. He rebuilt his routine, decorated the apartment the way he wanted, took a solo trip just because he could, started seeing someone new, slowly, carefully this time. The experience changed him, but not in a bitter way. It made him sharper, more aware. The biggest difference? He no longer ignored red flags. He no longer overextended himself trying to fix something alone. One evening, almost a year later, we were sitting around telling old stories again. Someone new in the group hadn't heard the legend yet, so it got told again. The family trip lie, the restaurant patio, the photos, the empty apartment, the midnight deadline. When the story ended, the new guy asked, "Did she deserve that?"
About 3 months after everything ended, something unexpected happened. He ran into her. Not planned, not arranged, just pure coincidence. It was a Saturday afternoon. He had gone to a small cafe near his new apartment, the kind of place where people sit with laptops and pretend to work while actually people watching. He liked it there because no one knew him. It felt neutral. He was standing in line, scrolling through his phone, when he heard a familiar laugh behind him. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Then he turned, and there she was. She froze the moment their eyes met. No dramatic music, no slow motion, just two people standing in a coffee shop carrying history between them. She looked different, not physically, but in her energy, less confident, less certain. He gave a small nod. Not warm, not cold, just neutral. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey." The line moved forward. Neither of them knew what to say next. When they got their drinks, they both instinctively stepped aside to the pickup counter at the same time. It felt awkward, but not explosive. "Can we sit for a minute?" she asked. He hesitated for half a second, then shrugged. "Sure." They sat at a small table by the window. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said something he didn't expect. "I deserved what happened." That caught him off guard. She continued. "At first, I was angry. I told people you overreacted, that you embarrassed me. But after a while, I realized you didn't embarrass me, I embarrassed myself." He didn't interrupt. She told him that things with the ex had ended almost immediately after she moved out. Apparently, he had never wanted anything serious. It was attention, nostalgia, ego, nothing real. "I thought I had options," she admitted. "Turns out I just made a mess." He took a sip of his coffee before replying. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said calmly, "but I wasn't going to let myself be the backup plan." She nodded slowly. That sentence still landed. Backup plan. She looked down at her cup. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." There it was. Not "I didn't think you'd find out," not "I didn't think I'd hurt you." She didn't think he would leave. That told him everything.
They talked for about 30 minutes, not about getting back together, not about fixing things, just closure. When they finally stood up to leave, she looked at him and said, "You handled it better than I would have." He smiled slightly. That's the point. They walked out separately, and that was the last real conversation they ever had. After that day, something fully settled inside him. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even about her. It was about understanding something important. People will only treat you the way you allow them to. Back when they were fighting before her family trip, he ignored small signs. Late-night texting, emotional distance, secretive behavior. He gave the benefit of the doubt every time. He realized that wasn't kindness. That was avoidance. Now, when he started dating again, he did things differently. If something felt off, he addressed it immediately. If effort wasn't mutual, he didn't overcompensate. If someone seemed unsure about him, he didn't try to convince them. He chose clarity over comfort. About 6 months later, he met someone new. She was different, direct, honest, calm. On their third date, he told her about what happened, not in a dramatic way, just as part of his past. Her response surprised him. She didn't praise the revenge. She didn't say it was savage. She said, "You respected yourself." And that meant more than any of our jokes about him being a legend, because at the end of the day, that's what the whole thing was about. Not punishing someone, not humiliating someone, just refusing to stay where he wasn't valued. One night, almost a year after everything happened, the story had already turned into a legend in our group. But for him, it wasn't a legend, it was just a chapter. By then, he'd fully settled into his new life. The apartment finally felt like home, not like a temporary escape. The walls had art on them, the kitchen had only the dishes he liked, the closet wasn't split in half. Those details mattered. There was no tension in the air anymore. No wondering who she was texting, no pretending not to notice distance. Peace became normal. The girl he started seeing months earlier, that slowly became something serious. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady. She communicated clearly. If she was upset, she said it. If she needed space, she explained why. It felt different. One night while they were cooking dinner together, she asked him something simple. "Did you ever want to get revenge?" He thought about it honestly. At first, he said, "Yeah, I wanted to confront her in that restaurant. I wanted to embarrass her." He paused. "Then I realized something. If I lost control, I'd look crazy, and she'd look like the victim." That's the part most people miss. If he'd yelled in public, made a scene, thrown her things out immediately, the story could have flipped. Suddenly, he'd be the angry boyfriend, the unstable one. Instead, he waited. He gathered proof, he followed the lease, he kept everything legal and clean. That control is what made the difference. A few months later, he ran into one of her old friends at a mutual gathering. The friend pulled him aside and said something interesting. "You know she tells people you were cold." He smiled slightly. "I was." The friend nodded. "But she also says you were fair." That word stuck. Fair. He didn't smear her reputation, didn't post the photos online, didn't message her family, didn't harass the ex. He handled it privately. And that's why even people who sided with her couldn't really argue with what he did. Eventually, the story stopped being about her completely. It became something else. Whenever someone in our group was dealing with disrespect in their relationship, someone would say, "Handle it like you did." And what that meant wasn't to kick them out dramatically. It meant to stay calm, get your facts, don't act out of emotion, and don't stay where you're not valued. One evening, about 2 years after everything happened, we were sitting around again. Someone newer to the group asked him directly, "Do you hate her?" He shook his head. "No, I actually hope she learns something." And he meant it. Because here's the truth he eventually admitted to us. If he hadn't caught her that night in the restaurant, he might have stayed. He might have kept trying, kept doubting himself, kept thinking he was the problem. Seeing the truth clearly, painful as it was, freed him. Sometimes closure doesn't come from a long emotional conversation. Sometimes it comes from undeniable proof. And sometimes the strongest move isn't yelling, it's silence. Years later, when he looks back at that time, he doesn't focus on the betrayal anymore. He remembers the moment he chose himself, the moment he realized he didn't have to compete with another man, he didn't have to beg for loyalty, he didn't have to convince someone to value him, he could simply step away. And that's what made the whole thing powerful. Not the empty apartment, not the midnight deadline, not even the photos. It was the decision. He could have reacted emotionally, he could have fought, he could have stayed. Instead, he made a plan, executed it calmly, and walked out with his dignity intact. And that's why the story still gets told. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was controlled. Not because it was cruel, but because it was firm. And most of all, because he proved something a lot of people struggle to do. When someone shows you they don't value you, you don't argue, you don't beg, you don't compete, you leave. Time passed, not weeks, not months, years. And something interesting happened. The story stopped feeling like revenge and started feeling like a turning point. By then, he was in a completely different place in life. Better job, better routine, healthier mindset. The relationship he had started after her had grown into something stable and mature. No drama, no guessing games, just mutual effort. One night, he was cleaning out an old storage box in his closet. Inside were random things from the old apartment. Old utility bills, a spare key, some photos from trips they had taken together. And at the bottom of the box, still inside that same brown envelope, were the printed pictures. He hadn't looked at them in a long time. He sat on the floor for a moment and stared at the envelope. Then he opened it. There she was, laughing on that patio, holding hands with her ex, that frozen moment that changed everything. He expected to feel something heavy, anger, hurt, bitterness, but there was nothing, just distance. It felt like looking at strangers. And that's when he realized he was truly over it. Not because he forgot, but because it no longer had power over him. He didn't keep the photos this time. He tore them in half, calmly, dropped them in the trash. Not out of rage, out of closure. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened again. He heard she was engaged. News travels through mutual friends, whether you want it to or not. At first, someone in our group joked, "Hope the guy signed a lease in his own name." We laughed, but he didn't. He just nodded and said, "Good for her." And he meant that too. Because by then, he understood something deeper. People don't always cheat because they're evil. Sometimes they cheat because they're immature, because they're insecure, because they're chasing attention instead of facing problems. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And understanding that helped him let go of the last tiny piece of resentment he didn't even know was still there. One evening, his current girlfriend asked him something thoughtful. If she hadn't cheated, do you think you would have married her? He thought about it seriously. Probably, he admitted, and that answer surprised even him. Because back then, he was heading in that direction. They had talked about future plans, vacations, even kids one day. But then he added something important. And I would have been miserable. That's the part people don't see. The betrayal didn't just end the relationship, it prevented a bigger mistake. If someone is willing to lie that smoothly before marriage, what happens after? If someone can step out during a rough patch, what happens during real hardship? Sometimes what feels like the worst thing that ever happened to you is actually protection. He started seeing it that way. Not as revenge, not as loss, but as redirection. Another year went by. One day, completely out of nowhere, she sent him a message. Just one line. "I'm sorry for who I was back then." No request, no drama, no reopening old wounds. Just that. He stared at it for a minute, then replied, "I hope you're doing better now." That was it. No long conversation, no revisiting history. Two people who once shared a life, now just distant chapters in each other's story. Later that night, when he told us about the message, someone asked, "Do you think she regrets it?" He shrugged. Probably, but regret doesn't change the lesson. And that lesson wasn't about cheating. It wasn't even about her. It was about standards. He learned that love without loyalty isn't love. That peace is more valuable than passion. That if someone can risk losing you, you shouldn't fight to stay. And most importantly, when someone shows you who they are, You don't argue with it, you accept it. Then you act accordingly. Years later, the story still gets told sometimes, but now it's different. It's not told like some wild revenge tale. It's told like an example of calm strength, of quiet boundaries, of knowing when to walk away. Because the real power in the whole thing wasn't the empty apartment. It wasn't the landlord backing him up. It wasn't even the midnight deadline. It was this: he refused to stay where he wasn't chosen, and that's what made it legendary. A few more years passed, and the story slowly turned from something fresh into something almost myth-like in our circle. New friends would join the group, someone would bring it up, and every time, details would get sharper, almost cinematic. But what most people didn't know was that behind the smooth plan, there were moments he never told anyone about. Small cracks. For example, the night after he saw her at that restaurant. He told us he was calm, and he was, but he didn't tell us that he sat in his car for almost 20 minutes before driving home. Not crying, not shaking, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what he had just seen. There's a strange feeling when someone you trust suddenly feels like a stranger. It's not loud, it's quiet, like something shifting inside your chest. He didn't react because he knew if he reacted right then, it would be pure emotion, and emotion doesn't think long-term. That night was when he made the real decision, not to punish her, but to never beg. That choice shaped everything after. Years later, when people asked him how he stayed so calm, he'd say something simple: "I didn't stay calm, I just waited." And that waiting changed the outcome. Because if he'd exploded that night, stormed over, confronted them, yelled, what would have happened? She might have cried in public, played the victim, claimed they were just talking, turned the story messy. Instead, he gathered proof, and silence became his advantage. There's something powerful in silence when someone expects chaos. One unexpected twist came almost 4 years after everything ended. He got a message from the ex. Yes, that ex. Apparently, they had briefly crossed paths at some event, and later that evening, he sent a message. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't mocking, it was awkward. "Hey man, I didn't know you two were still living together back then. She told me you were basically broken up." He read the message twice. Interesting. So even the ex hadn't known the full truth. That meant she had been lying in both directions, telling her boyfriend she was visiting family, telling her ex she was practically single. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It just confirmed what he already understood. When someone is dishonest once, they're usually dishonest in layers. He didn't argue with the guy, didn't insult him. He just replied, "Doesn't matter now. It's done." And that was that. Another layer closed. What makes this part of the story important isn't drama, it's clarity. He realized most people learn the hard way. When someone cheats, it's rarely a sudden mistake. It's usually a series of small choices stacked on top of each other. Secret conversations, hidden messages, emotional distancing, private justifications. By the time the physical betrayal happens, the emotional betrayal started long before. That's why he never blamed himself for not trying harder. You can't fix something alone, and you can't compete with someone who's already entertaining alternatives. Years later, when he eventually proposed to the woman he had been dating after her, it felt completely different from what he once imagined with his ex. There was no doubt, no insecurity, no checking phones, no wondering, just calm certainty. On the night of his engagement party, someone, after a few drinks, shouted across the room, "To the most organized breakup in history." Everyone laughed. He laughed too. But then he raised his glass and said something that stuck with all of us. It wasn't organized, it was necessary. That's the difference. Revenge is emotional, necessity is rational. He didn't leave to hurt her, he left because staying would have hurt him. And that shift in perspective is why the story still holds weight. Because at the core of it, it's not about cheating, it's about standards. It's about understanding that love without loyalty isn't love, that sharing a home with someone means trust is not optional, and that if someone risks losing you, you shouldn't fight to prove your worth. You step aside and let them feel the loss. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. By now, the legend part doesn't even matter. What matters is this: that one calm decision years ago changed the direction of his entire life. If he ignored it, if he forgave without accountability, if he stayed out of fear of being alone, he wouldn't be where he is now. Sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting, it's packing your things quietly and walking away. And that's why even after all these years, when someone says, "best cheating revenge ever," the real ones know it wasn't revenge, it was self-respect.
By the time 5 years had passed, the story barely felt connected to his current life. He was married now. Stable job, new house, different city. The old apartment, the brown envelope, the midnight deadline, all of it felt like something that happened to a younger version of him. But life has a funny way of bringing old chapters back for one last reminder. It happened at a wedding. Not his, not hers. A mutual friend from years back was getting married, and somehow both of them ended up on the guest list. He didn't know she would be there, and she didn't know he would. The reception hall was loud, bright, full of music and chatter. He was standing near the bar with his wife when he felt a familiar presence across the room. You know that feeling when someone from your past walks into your line of sight and time slows down just a little? There she was, dressed elegantly, hair shorter than before, standing beside a man, probably the fiancé she had once told him about years ago. They made eye contact. This time, there was no tension, no shock, no sharp emotional twist, just recognition. He leaned slightly toward his wife and said calmly, "That's someone I used to date." She nodded casually, no insecurity, no drama, just trust. That alone told him how far he'd come. A little later in the evening, she approached their table, not alone, with her husband. Introductions were polite, simple, adult. No one mentioned the past. But at one point, when their spouses drifted into separate conversations, she looked at him and gave a small smile. "You look happy," she said. "I am," he replied, and he meant it fully. There was no performance in his voice, no trying to prove anything, just truth. She nodded slowly. "I'm glad." For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Not regret, not longing, just acknowledgement. Two people who once shared a life, who broke it, who survived it, and then moved on. Later that night, while driving home, his wife asked, "Did seeing her feel weird?" He thought about it honestly. Not weird, just distant. And that was the final piece. Distant. The girl who once lived in his apartment, who once lied about visiting her family, who once stood shocked in an empty living room. She wasn't a villain in his story anymore. She wasn't a lesson anymore either. She was just a memory. Back home that night, he sat on the couch for a while after his wife went to bed. He thought about that younger version of himself, sitting in his car outside that restaurant, staring at the steering wheel. If he could speak to that version of himself, he would say one thing: trust what you saw and don't be afraid to walk away. Because that moment, the decision to stay calm instead of explosive, shaped everything that came after. If he'd reacted differently, maybe he would have stayed in contact longer. Maybe they would have dragged the breakup out. Maybe resentment would have built. Maybe he would have carried bitterness into future relationships. But he didn't. He cut it clean. And clean endings don't leave infection. That's why the story still matters. Not because it was savage, not because it was dramatic, but because it proved something powerful. You don't need to destroy someone to win. You just need to remove yourself with dignity. Years later, when people ask him what the best revenge is, he doesn't talk about the empty apartment. He doesn't mention the midnight deadline. He says something much simpler. The best revenge is moving on so completely that it no longer matters. And that's exactly what he did.
Years after the empty apartment, the brown envelope, and the midnight deadline, he had become a person who didn't tolerate dishonesty, who valued his own time and energy, and who understood the quiet strength of leaving instead of fighting. Life had grown in ways that were both subtle and profound. He had a career he loved, a home he was proud of, and a partner who respected him. None of these things happened overnight. Each was built on lessons learned, some harsh, some quiet. That moment of clarity in his old apartment had been the first real step in choosing himself over someone else's deception. The story still occasionally came up in conversation with friends, new partners, strangers who somehow heard bits of it. But over time, it became less about her and more about him, how he handled it. The calm, the planning, the dignity, those were the parts that stuck. One evening, his wife asked him to tell it again for the new group of friends they were hosting. He started as he always did, slowly and deliberately. The family trip lie, the restaurant patio, the photos. The friends leaned in, captivated. When he reached the part where the apartment was empty except for her belongings neatly stacked in the middle of the room, even seasoned storytellers in the group gasped. "What did she do?" someone asked. He smiled faintly. Nothing. She had to move. That was her choice. And that was the real secret, the power of control without chaos. The apartment, the landlord, the timing, all logistical tools, but the true skill lay in his restraint, his patience, and his refusal to argue with reality. A few months later, he reflected privately on the entire episode. The lessons now were part of his life philosophy. When someone shows you who they really are, trust it. Don't fight to stay where you're not valued. Revenge doesn't have to be dramatic. Clarity and action speak louder than emotion. Moving on completely is more satisfying than holding on to resentment. And sometimes, what feels like a terrible ending is actually a redirection towards something better. He thought about her only occasionally, and never with bitterness. Instead, he felt gratitude that the experience had taught him so much. The photos, the empty apartment, the midnight deadline all became symbols not of humiliation, but of empowerment. Over time, he began to mentor friends quietly about relationships, not in a preachy way, not with judgment, just sharing stories, subtly, about boundaries, self-respect, and recognizing dishonesty before it drains your life. He rarely mentioned names or specifics, but everyone could feel the weight and wisdom behind his words. And sometimes, when he was alone, he would smile quietly to himself, thinking of that younger version of him sitting in the car outside the restaurant. The fear, the hurt, the uncertainty. That single act of restraint had defined his path from heartbreak to peace. Ultimately, the best cheating revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about walking away on his own terms, about keeping his dignity, about proving to himself that he could be hurt but not destroyed, about showing that life continues, even grows after betrayal, sometimes in ways far better than imagined. Years later, the story circulates among friends and acquaintances as a legendary tale, but for him, it's simply a reminder. True strength isn't loud, true justice doesn't scream. True victory comes quietly, with your head held high, moving toward a life you actually deserve. And that, more than anything, is what made it unforgettable.